I think when you meet a new painting, it's like meeting a new person. You size them up, you gauge your reaction to them, you sort of decide whether you think you like them or not, and sometimes even fall in love across a crowded room. And then the first thing people want to do is to analyse their reactions. If it's about a person, they tend to be polite enough to retire to the loo or the pub to do that. But with paintings, I mean, they just stand up there and let fly. It's sophisticated, it's primitive, it's luscious, it's austere, it's modernist, postmodernist, sexist, romantic, feminist, whatever. But once, I mean, this is important to us to try and work out what it is we're feeling about this thing. The other thing we always like to do is to get the goss about a person. You always want to know where they've come from, what their history is and their background. And it's the same with paintings, really. And who better to give us the goss on these paintings but the artists themselves, who can try and tell us what they think they thought at the time at which they actually created these works. Thank you very much to Kerry McInnis on my right and Judith White on my left for coming here this afternoon to tell us everything we need to know. And I thought we'd just kick off with a question that's mildly biographical. It's not meant to be a sort of life history, but what was it that drew you into art, and what was it particularly that influenced you and sort of turned you towards landscape painting? And I'll lead off with Judith.
Good question. You do wonder yourself after a while, after a few decades. But I suppose I was really interested in music and art, and being at school at the time I was, you couldn't do both. Remember those years, folks? I don't know if it's still the same. So I went and got involved in music and spent the whole of the time that I should have been doing music hanging around the art department, to the point where the art teacher took pity on me and said, "I think you best come inside." So that was sort of how I got into that. I mean, I'm still very interested in music, but I realised that being an artist was really what I was going to be, and I suppose did the usual thing where you're just doing heaps of drawing when you're younger, and it just develops into something that becomes a bit of an obsession. Landscape painting's a bit of has been, over the decades I've been working, a slightly difficult problem for me, because I find, years ago, I didn't really want to be a landscape painter at all, didn't want to touch it. I just felt that in Australia, every idea to do with the landscape was so suffocated by issues to do with nationalism and the quality of the landscape that was particularly Australian, which I found really suffocating. I also thought that the history of landscape painting for most Australians revolved around male artists, the Streetons and the McCubbins and all of those, the history of the Golden Pastures and that sort of era of Australian landscape painting was very dominating. I'm talking about 30 or 40 years ago, so things have changed. But all of that sort of made me hold the idea of painting landscape at a great distance from what I was doing. So I was doing all sorts of other things, and then I got dragged screaming and kicking to the desert with somebody who really kept saying to me, "I think you should go and see the desert." And you're going, no, 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 no. If I go there and I see red soil and blue sky, I'll throw up. I thought, there's no way I'm getting into that one. And of course it was at the Flinders Ranges, which had lots of pink and cream and lovely colours. There was a bit of blue sky and a little bit of red soil, but there was all these other options, visual options. And that really started the process for me in terms of working in landscape. And then I suppose I've moved from that into figures in landscape, which is where I'm at now. So that brings me up to date.
Yeah, there's a few ideas there we'll come back to. Your turn.
I may have forgotten the question. Let's see. I grew up in Latin America, in Guatemala, and it's quite a wonderful place, full of color and mystery. And as a child, I used to go to the marketplaces, and they had all the different color, the skeins of yarn that had been just spun with all the different color wools. You can't possibly imagine the number of colors. And they'd be hanging over the rafters in these big warehouses where the markets were. So as a child, I just used to walk around and look at these, and I'm sure that it imbued me with a strong sense of and appreciation of color. I think that's probably the first thing I remember about my interest in art. And then also in Guatemala, my 4th grade teacher, whose name was Mrs. Kepke, was I'm amazed I remember that, but anyway, she was an artist, and she really spent a lot of time with the kids. So we were only 9 years old or something. And we did a lot of painting. And I think at the time, I said to myself, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And there's always this kind of eureka moment when you become aware that something significant has happened. And for me, that's the age that it was. So like Judith, I just then painted all the time, drew all the time. And the only other incident that I can think of that was formative, I guess, was after Latin America, we went to the US, where I went to high school and uni. But in those the late 60s and the early 70s, I was what you would call a Beatlemaniac. Do you remember? Do some of you remember the Beatles? Anyway, and so I used to sketch their portraits all the time for years, 4 or 5 years. And that then led to my sort of parallel passion, which is portraiture. So that was for years of sketching them, so that led me on there. And for landscape work, at university I studied art, and I was in Vermont, in the mountains in Vermont, which has a wonderful quality of serenity and desolateness, which is what appeals to me and has continued to appeal to me in the landscape. So I started doing landscape painting, I guess, at university, but life happens in between, and really in the last maybe 15 years, I've really focused on my landscape work, going out into the desert, like Judith said, and other places. Yeah. So, yeah.
In both of your works, there is water and pools and light. So I'm going to plunge straight into the pool and ask you to comment on light in your paintings and how that seems to feature. In Judith's paintings, the light seems to draw you into some sort of limitless infinity somewhere. In yours, it's more in your face, I think, and up front and brilliant.
The light, do you want me to? Okay. For me, when I go out into the landscape, and it's usually out in, arid Australia particularly, I usually tend to select the early part of the day or the latter part of the day, as many artists do, because the light creates shadows and patterns that you can play with as devices to pull the viewer into the picture or not. So it gives you directional lines and things that you can use compositionally to, so light being used as something that doesn't have anything to do with light, but it has to do with composition and form, if that makes sense. Also, I use the light, I often use backlighting, so light coming from behind, and that creates this sort of halo around objects that are in between you and the light source, and it creates a very strong sense of form. So, and I like that idea that shapes become isolated in the landscape, and they're separated from the landscape. So you get this perhaps slightly surreal sort of feeling about it. And I guess that's how I use light. In the, yeah.
Over to you.
I think probably for me the light seems to just appear in the painting as I'm developing it. It's something that I'm aware of right from the start, and I treat it more as some quite potent component to do with natural landscape forces. So ordinary things, not ordinary, but the more easily understood ones like water and organic form and wind and movement, to me are all, can be governed a little bit by the sense of light, because light will illuminate the effects of all of that sort of interaction, all of the interaction between those forces. To me, the light is the way I can see them. So I begin my paintings being really aware of the light coming up from the canvas, and I work from light to dark as a watercolourist would work, which is quite an interesting thing to intellectualise. When you work with watercolour, the paper itself has the highest tone or the lightest part of your picture. So you hold that all the way through. So you work mentally from light to dark, and you're adding more and more colour, more and more tone, and that idea of the light from the paper is there as a constant. When you work in oils, it's just a slight sweeping statement, but it's sort of the way you can think about it. You often are thinking in reverse, and you're working from shadows to light, because an oil painter can mix up the light, can make the highlight colour, the bright bits of light that are in the picture, and add them later, whereas you can't really do that with watercolour, because you're working with the idea of going from in the opposite way, from light to dark. So I've spent a lot of time working in watercolour, and I haven't lost that state of mind, which is pretty bizarre. Because I suppose I was working in watercolour for about 10 years and then moved into acrylic and mixed media, and that notion of where the light is in the canvas is there right from the start. So I keep the backlight right the way through, and then slowly, slowly, slowly take it out as I'm going with the build-up of pigment and build-up of collage material. So if it's gone, if it goes too early or I lose it, the painting's gone. I just start again. Like a watercolour. You know how a ruthless watercolour is. If you get it wrong, there's no way you can cover it up or go over it.
I'm a little bit less forgiving. I just like, if I've lost the light, I just go, forget this, and I just get the thing of white and I just throw it at the work, you know. Well, and then I start scratching back and well, whatever.
Well, that's what you can do with a material that's not transparent.
Yeah,
but
that's
with watercolour, it's transparent, so you can't actually do that.
I know.
But with mixed media, you can go both ways. You can work sort of from light to dark and from dark to light. But I still find that if I've lost that light and have to put it back in, I'm not nearly as satisfied. No.
So the light has to stay there for you, and then that's why you have this sense of it being right at the base at the bottom of the picture, and escaping through in sort of little shafts and trickles through it. Great. Now, the next question was going to be about colour, because, of course, you walk into this room, the first thing that hits you is blinding colour. Whereas actually you walk upstairs and it's somewhat more restrained. So,
it is rather, isn't it?
Yeah, would you like to comment on that, Mister? That I will start with?
You want to start with them? Okay. Colour. I think probably colour to me has a fairly strong emotional content, obviously. If you've got lots of blues and cool colours, it tends to be a little bit more mysterious, a little bit more melancholic at times, or mood-inducing. This painting behind me is called Blue-Green Zone, and I'm really working with the idea of creating a certain emotional condition, which we'll probably talk about later. But I must admit, I do start off with great intentions to have lots of colour, and it all seems to go away. So I don't know what happens. You can enlighten me, Kerry. How do you get such a great red? It's really good.
Oh.
Red's a hard colour.
Oh, cadmium red.
Is it? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I don't want to.
I finished.
To answer your question specifically about the colors, in terms of technique, I usually start with acrylic, and you can work rather frenetically, which I do.
So the base of the picture is acrylic?
Yes.
Okay.
Right the way across, virtually the whole surface.
And is that really thin? Sorry, this is technical questions here, guys.
Yeah.
That's really thin?
This is good. I should say that the works on paper, which are the sketches, are done on site. They're always done with acrylic, dilute acrylic, and dry media. But the paintings are done with acrylic, and then I overpaint them in oil. And so the oil has a moderating influence. But in the areas that I want the brilliance to remain, it usually stays as acrylic.
Oh, wow.
I will sometimes add, if I can find a good quality pigment that can match the brilliance in oil, I will use it. But not every area on the painting is painted over with oil. It's just some places.
That's pretty unusual, because a lot of people say that acrylic is a bit flatter and goes a bit matte and dry, and you can't get that same luminosity that you can with oil. So that's pretty extraordinary. And do you work with the acrylic? Sorry. And do you work with the acrylic because of its immediacy, or just because you get your base dry fast?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Oh yeah, it's just so exciting. You know, you get the acrylic up, and you're kind of attacking the canvas, and in this frenzy, and it all has to dry and dribble and make a mess, and then it's dry very quickly, and then you can go back over it again, and so the acrylic is just terrific for that. But then the oil enables you to do other things as well in terms of mark making, which is exciting. But you know, the work, the tenor, the key of the color in this exhibition is much higher than it has been for me in the past. I have to say, my colors have usually been more subdued, and it's just, I think I know what happened. I went to the same place in the centre of Australia. It's just that I decided to work from the sketches and not from photographs. And when you're working from the sketches, which you can see, they're done on site. So the feeling of light and the key of the pigments is much higher than it is, you know, when you're working from photographs. So I think that's why the colors are brighter, possibly in this show, than they have been in the past.
Either that, or we should know what wine you were drinking at the time, what you were on at the time. Now, figures. In your paintings, there are some dingoes and some little birds, but apart from that, no sign of human habitation, whereas you have deliberately introduced human beings into the mix. So, you want to start?
Yeah, Judith, because it's so important.
The content, the human content, has sprung a little bit from a couple of projects I had last year, which were to do with medical research. I was invited to be the artist in residence for the Hunter Medical Research Institute, and that culminated in an exhibition at the Maitland Regional Gallery. In terms of my work continuity, it's a little bit of a departure, but one that I've welcomed, because I have really enjoyed the idea of using figures in landscape, and the figures to me are a little bit elemental. They are based on real people. They're based on very specific people, because I didn't want them to be just sort of too anonymous in terms of their body language, so that you could recognise them as ordinary people, so to speak, because the political parameter that I'm working on is the issue that human beings are part of nature, part of all of the elements that make up the natural world, and all of those elements are flowing through people, are in rocks, trees, water, bodies, and your attention or perception in my paintings, I'm hoping indicates that, so that your eye moves through the picture and you can suddenly see a form or a person. And all of those elements are affected by the forces of nature, so that you get a lot of energy flowing through, both from the natural environment and the idea of the figures in the landscape.
I don't know how to think about the introduction of the human form, or even the concept of humanity into the landscape. It's something that I've thought about a lot. I find it's a bit problematic for me, and I don't know why that is, except that when I'm out in the bush and I'm confronted by the isolation of a place, apart from myself, it's as if humanity doesn't really belong there. I don't know why I should feel that. And I think maybe it's because I'm trying to tap into something that might be older than, let me say, white man's presence there. But a few years ago, I decided to start introducing the dingo into some of my works, because the dingo's been around for, about 5,000 years or so certainly longer than white man. And I thought there was something about the nature of the dingo that I felt matched the rawness and the unpredictability of the Australian bush. Because the dingo is very elusive. You only will see them a few times when you're on a trip. Certainly not to photograph them, or if you photograph them, they're about this small in the photograph. And I like that elusive quality. It's kind of mysterious, and I think it matches what I'm looking for in the landscape. So it's appropriate somehow for my work,
Now, going out to paint in the landscape. So, would you like to comment on the significance of that expedition to go out there and paint? So, for example, with the sketches, are they an attempt to paint what's there, and then you come back and do oils and paint what's not there in a sort of way? I mean, you've talked about is the first thing to be faithful to the landscape and the second to move beyond the landscape, or as you say, to introduce the intangible into the work?
Mm-hmm. When I'm actually out and I set up my easel, and I often go with other artists, or sometimes I'll go on a trip with my husband, who's another artist. He's a sculptor. And we'll just find a place or whatever, if something appeals, and I'll sort of head off with my backpack with all my paints, and I'll just be there for hours. There's a kind of a quietness and a solitude about the whole experience. And I really am just responding to what I'm seeing. I usually tend to draw the middle ground. I'm not that interested in foreground or background. That's my own personal preference. So I'll do that, and I'll do that reasonably representationally, I think. If you look at the sketches, you'll see they kind of look like something that you might recognize as a rock or a tree or whatever. But when I take those back into the studio, the experience of then working from those onto an oil, I try and introduce some other qualities that I have felt while I was there. A loneliness, or a desolation, or a rawness. And also the process of painting, which has nothing to do with where you are. It's the process of painting that takes over. And that's just so cool and so exciting, because you're just in the moment dealing with this pigment on this surface, and you're just scratching it or whatever. You've even forgotten that it's a landscape. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense, but you just in the moment applying paint onto something and constantly stepping back and then going back and stepping back and going back to the surface. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but
Not quite happens to me. I think probably what you're saying, I can understand. It happens more in terms that this thing that you're doing outside has a character and a personality that you're having to deal with. So there you are on your own in the landscape, and suddenly you're not on your own because you've got this painting with you, and it becomes this thing that you're dealing with. Yeah, I can identify with that. I suppose to me the way of getting the figures happening, in a landscape happened quite profoundly for me, in that I really couldn't work out what I was going to do going on a trip with a bunch of artists to the Larapinta area west of Alice Springs. And I really enjoyed the experience with the other artists, but I didn't know how I was going to handle the idea of the subject. And halfway through the trip, 3 of the women on the trip, nobody else, we were the only mad buggers, decided we were going to go for a swim in the Fink River. It was so cold. I have never swum in water that cold. I reckon you could come close to feeling like you were going to die. And I liked that sensation, because what it brought to the fore was how vulnerable we are as human beings, as human critters in the landscape, that you could be just zapped off the face of the earth quite quickly, either with the heat, which was pretty extraordinary, or in terms of just deciding that you were going to cool off in some water. And it was this very dense, cold, black water. And it was more that sensation that I really was affected by when I got back. And it took quite a while for me to research a way of having figures in water. Here was the water bit, and I needed the content of the figures for what I was approaching in terms of the medical research project. And it was through that experience, my own personal physical experience of swimming in the water. I don't know whether the other artists got anything out of it, but once I realised the visual significance of it, I rushed out of the water and rushed up to my knapsack and grabbed my camera, thinking I've just got to get a photograph of a body in here, and rushed back. And the other artist that was crazy enough to do the swimming with me got really angry and said, "You're not going to take a photograph of me?" and threw her clothes on and rushed off. So I was a bit late. You know when you feel like you should have had the camera earlier, but it didn't matter. It all went in.
Okay.
I was okay when I got back.
Just quickly, do you go looking for particular landscapes, rather than the way people suss out locations for a film set or something? Do you both look for water or lack of water or small amounts of water? So if we took you, out to somewhere or other, we'd just say, no, that won't do at all. I've got to have this kind of landscape. Do you look for something in particular?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you do your research first, so that you're not spending a lot of days disappointed. For me, as I mentioned before, I'm particularly attracted to the middle ground, and a particularly scrappy subject, scruffy and scratchy, and because I know that the marks that I can make from those will appeal to me. Yeah. So that really does determine, to a certain degree, the nature of the bush that I'm looking for. Majestic vistas do nothing for me, even though they're wonderful to look at. But very dense rainforest probably would be just too soft and luscious and comfortable. So
as an artist, the scruffier and scrawnier, the better.
For the moment, that's what I like.
Okay.
Is that the thing to do with the line too? Because your line's a really important part of your painting practice too. I think that's a similarity between both our works that I find pretty interesting.
Yes.
Because I respond to your line. I like the lines that you make. And lines in painting are almost like your handwriting.
Yes.
They really are the direct mark of the artist. So I think sometimes you look for environments that might give you that in terms of actual mark making.
I think so.
And rainforests and spectacular vistas would be a little bit bereft of interesting lines.
Yeah, that's right. I agree.
Which takes me to my next question, which is, again to you, Kerry, there's a sort of vitality in your paintings that flows from the brushstrokes. So there can't be any sort of faking or correcting or fudging of those brushstrokes. Is there a sort of immediacy? Do you have to strike a balance between the marks that you make and can't unmake and then changing, adapting things in some way?
I think you can always change everything.
Ah, right, okay. End of that question.
It's that white. You just get the white and go.
Yeah, that's right. Just fling the white over it.
Look, I reckon you can just
Reverse everything.
You know what I call it? I call it when I'm not happy with something, and when something's getting just too fiddly and too ditzy or something, I say, I've got to blitz this. And I use that word, blitz it, and then I go at it and I literally kind of attack the canvas. I'm usually listening to hip hop or rap music, which is what I paint to.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I just kind of blitz it and cover it and scratch it, and I might scratch. I mean, I have actually put holes in things because I just get so vigorous with this. And then I have to really scrap it. But
it's just that the black, you know, at the end there, it's almost calligraphic, you know.
I should say, I'm sorry, I haven't said, I do a lot of work with oil stick, because Judith was talking about the line in paintings and how important it is for her, and for me too. I'll work with paint, but then I'll get an oil stick and I'll just kind of lose it, and I'll kind of go up and I'll go, like that, you know, and then scratch back. So that's actually a black oil stick, probably on top.
You've deliberately introduced the notion of external landscapes and internal landscapes. So would you like to comment on that? There's a sort of, both are fluid and inconstant.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit to do with the politics of the human body being made up of all the elements in nature, and that you're moving from one environment inside a body to the outside. So the figures become transparent. They also have bits of landscape, bits of anything organic that's going through them, as a way of expressing that idea. Also, I think that sort of reference to the idea of the figure in the landscape being an expression of perhaps emotion or state of mind. So there's a certain, I hope, poetic connection with the way the figures work. So when you're looking at the figures, you can perhaps put your own story to them. I'm not wanting to make too much of a story because they're not really descriptive of anything specific. But I hope that when you're looking at the figures, that you can make some connection with your own aspects, your own aspects in your life that would relate to a certain mood, certain relationships with other people, that more psychological, poetic, all along those sort of lines in terms of personal interaction with the painting, rather than me saying, well, it's about being sad or it's about being whatever. So the internal landscape of the body also has a lot to do with emotional, psychological conditions and states of mind, because that's just as important in terms of a landscape, what's going on in your head, as what's going on outside.
So would you say, I would think that neither of you are traditional landscape artists, in that you're using landscape to get somewhere else. So that's more or less what you were saying. And Kerry, you talk about transcending place.
And the spirit of country and those things that are outside, perhaps the story of the picture.
So getting past a particular location to something that that resonates, has a sort of sense of familiarity, even though you've never been there in your life. Something beyond the actual landscape.
I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing. I'm not sure that I know, but I'm wondering whether a lot of it might be self-reflexive, perhaps more so than I might even imagine. That it might have more to do with me challenging myself to being out in an isolated area than I actually think it does. Because when I'm there and I'm painting, I'm not really aware of those things. So, I think that maybe I need to do it for another few decades, and then maybe I'll understand.
That's okay. I think you can leave it to everyone else to sort of work out what you're doing. And you just carry on doing what you're doing. But obviously, process is the process of painting, as you said, is very important. The 1890s plein air movement got onto this because of the notion of going out to paint in the landscape. But when you went back to that point, it was really an attempt to escape the conservative nature of the schools, where they wanted you to paint scenes from the Bible or from, you know, sort of history or something like that. Various people then said, no, we'll go outside and paint because this will be a way of arriving at a national painting style, at an Australian landscape style. So they made that break. They produced what you felt to be a sort of slightly overwhelming tradition of landscape painting. Do you see yourselves as painting in that tradition, or does it not matter?
The quintessential Australian landscape. Oh, yeah. I think it's something that just happens naturally, and I think other people can see it more than you can. I always feel that a lot of Australian artists, whether they're conscious of it or not, paint in a way that somehow alludes to a lot of space. That's the only thing that I've picked up from comments made about my pictures, where somebody, not so much these figure ones, but the previous ones, where somebody said to me, they're very Australian, and you're going, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. It was a Frenchman said that, and I had to think about it and then queried it, and he said, well, there's always some sort of sense of space. And I said, yeah, well, that's probably what you'd find anywhere, you'd find in other parts of Europe. He said, no, it's not that. There's some other element within the way the paintings are going together that I can pick as being something Australian, something that he sensed from being here, coming from Europe, and that was that sense of space. And there are things too that I think you tend to back off, having been educated, like born in Australia, educated here, in that there was a time to remember when they used to talk about the Australian inland and the deserts and those areas as being the part of the timeless land, and you had this whole concept of the age of Australia. I think that was another one that I was quite cynical about and felt like, I'm sure I'll get off the plane in the Flinders Desert and it'll be so timeless I'll be gobsmacked. And of course it was. Hello, I mean, and I really didn't expect it, but then I tend to have a little bit of an inbuilt cynicism to any sort of cultural sweeping statements, and I must admit that I was a bit sus about Paris having a fabulous light, thinking, yeah, sure, you know, it's got this amazing quality. Hit the streets of Paris, there it was. Hit the desert in Australia, and it was truly spooky, that sense of history and the age of the land, and you can really, really feel it. And I think that might creep in somehow. I think those things happen automatically. They're almost subconscious. And if you try and quantify them as the artist, you end up probably shooting yourself in the foot or the hand, whichever part of your anatomy you paint with, because it becomes too much of a bind, then it oppresses you, and you're constantly on the lookout for it. But that integrity aspect, I think, comes from what you're talking about when you go outside, and that, I think, is part of maybe the magic or the power of the plein air movement. And it's interesting that it's really coming back again. There's now a plein air prize, which means you really have to be outside and do a painting, and then that's the only way you can get into the competition, which is weird because, you know, 20 to 30 years ago, it was all rubbish. Anything that was painted outside wasn't considered of any consequence, and it was all very much studio-based. And then they thought painting was dead. That was another little delightful theory, that as a painter, you thought, oh, fine, okay. And all of that just comes and goes, which is interesting, but I'm finding it quite intriguing that plein air is back again, and maybe I think it's just got something to do with a spiritual connection that people are needing to reignite, and you can get that quite rapidly by going out into the landscape.
The Australian landscape is so vast that you really actually have to make a considered effort to get out there to be in it. It's not like landscape painting in other places in the world where I have painted as well, where you can really just go a couple of miles and you might, you know, do an urban landscape or a rural scene that's only 5 minutes away from the city. We're talking about actually having to fly somewhere and then drive for hours somewhere to get out to these places. So I'm glad that it's a tradition, because it's so fantastic to have the opportunity and to be so lucky to be able to have the opportunity to go out there and try that. And I hope that I can do it for many years. But so that is the nature of the Australian continent that creates this slightly different thing. But getting back to your question, I'm not aware of being part of any tradition or continuum, because an artist really is just doing what they want to do. Somebody else is making them part of the continuum, if that makes sense. You know, so yeah.
Both of you have touched on this, but I mean, a year from, do you see yourself as moving on in any particular direction from this body of work?
I've just come back from Antarctica.
Oh, right. Well, that's a considerable change.
Make the most of the red, everyone. Make the most of the red, because I'm not sure that's going to be around for a while.
The red is gone. The red is gone. No, look, it was so... On plein air? It was on plein air with fingerless gloves. It was fantastic, and yeah, and actually it was terrific, and that'll be my next body of work. The simplicity of the forms in the ice are forcing me on a journey which I know I'm on, but I'm kind of dragging my heels a bit, and that is to simplify form and to look for something much simpler in nature. And the Antarctic landscape does that just by default, you know, and so I'm excited about that prospect of paring down and getting to the basics and simplifying. So that's kind of where I'm headed. I don't know where I'm going to end up, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, probably a little bit along the lines of what I'm doing, but I'm feeling like I'd like to get into some landscape environment for a while, just for the isolation factor, and see how I can, if the figures are going to connect with that issue. So I'm not entirely sure. I'm just sort of going to go back to sitting around drawing for a while and work on paper just for a bit.
See what comes up.
Yeah.
Okay. First, to thank Judith and Kerry for very important.
And I think we should thank Susan Butler.
And I think we should thank our audience for coming along and being so attentive and asking such nice questions. Thank you. So now we can wander around and have a look at the painting with all of that information. Having got the goss, we can go and apply it to the painting.